What if there are remedies to burnout so you can finally get to the business of designing your legacy? Good morning. My name is Angelina Carleton. I'm the hostess to the Design Your Legacy podcast. And this lovely day, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Scott Anderson. He was born into an entrepreneurial family who understood the value of hard work, perseverance, and grit. Scott's entry into business started when he was tasked with turning around a third generation family group of construction equipment and industrial engineering engine companies, which he was able to scale and sell at a premium. Following this, Scott built 3 for-profit businesses, including an agency that he ran for over 25 years and later sold to his employees. Scott combined his business acumen with his experiences as a licensed mental health therapist to establish the not-for-profit ateaseusa.org, which develops and deploys leading-edge PTSD treatment technology in partnership with Tel Aviv University and the Israeli government. Welcome, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Angelina. It's great to be here.
Yes, thank you very much for being a guest speaker. It is my pleasure to have you on this platform. And I wanted to start with your interest in individuals that have experienced shell shock and PTSD. So if you would, tell me a little bit about what drew you to this topic.
Originally I had the chance encounter with parents of children that were adult children that were deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in a couple of cases, the children that were returning from overseas were returning with really severe post-traumatic stress disorder and also traumatic brain injury, or TBI. And I didn't know anything about any of this really, but I got to see these military folks through the eyes of their parents and the suffering the parents were going through, watching their children be disabled, mentally and emotionally disabled this way. And a lot of these military folks returning were decorated with all kinds of medals and awards for bravery and valor, but they were returning to the United States really in a discounted or a kind of a diminished state. And so it was heartbreaking for me to see this, not only to see these parents' children, but to see them through the parents' eyes. And that's what really got my attention to begin with.
Sure. And this must have been before 2007, because in 2007, you began the accelerator.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it was about in 2006 or so. And I met, one of the things that really struck me was I met the mom of a Marine captain who was one of the first to go to Afghanistan after 9/11, and unfortunately was one of the first killed. And his mom went through something I didn't realize was possible, but she was going through her own version of PTSD as a civilian. I mean, had a combatant son, but she was technically a civilian. And she told me about her own journey through post-traumatic stress disorder, and basically waiting for either to get a phone call saying that her son had been injured but was okay, or for a van to pull up and dress Marine uniforms to come to the door and say, your son is gone. And she slipped into this, what's sometimes called virtual PTSD, but I think it's bona fide PTSD, where she kept her blinds drawn and was really becoming more and more agoraphobic out of the fear of either the phone call or the visit from these Marines that would mean her son was either injured or killed. And so she told me about her own journey through PTSD, and I didn't realize that it's not only possible but often likely for parents and loved ones, children, and so forth of combatants to also encounter post-traumatic stress disorder. And there was a complete eye-opener for me.
Yes, absolutely. I know that you definitely have a heart for this subject because you also see the ripple effects when it comes to victims of domestic violence and children of sexual abuse and just the ripple effect across society. So it completely applies to this niche, but it also transcends in the human experience from what you saw in your professional life.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted, just in case someone who's listening might not know what agoraphobia is, that's the fear of the social reaction. Is that accurate in the technical term?
Basically, yeah. I mean, the symptoms that you see are people gradually withdraw and isolate themselves more and more and more, and can get to the point where they are afraid to leave their homes or have any social interaction at all.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate the work that you do because I've often said, as the child of a military brat, there's always a manual and a guide for doing everything, you know. But
Yeah.
where is the guide when when there's been a trained killer, you know, basically to go to the front lines, and now they've got to come home, and how do they piece it all back together in that emotional IQ piece that the family really needs and society and the community needs?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the reasons I got interested in 2007 was there was a report written by for then President George W. Bush on behalf, and there were two experts on PTSD who wrote a report about this. It was called the Report on Wounded Warriors. The first time I think I'd ever heard the term. Anyway, the report basically said that of all of the returning combatants with PTSD who are eligible for VA treatment, less than a third of them were going to the VA for treatment. And and there are a number of reasons for that, including the stigma of post-traumatic stress disorder and also the nature of the illness itself, which is makes people not want to talk about it and want to isolate and all of that. But it struck me as a real tragedy that two-thirds of the folks returning, having done some really brave, honorable things, are returning in this diminished state, but aren't getting any help. And what I began to see in my own community was that these folks ended up being, a lot of them, homeless, and which just struck me as completely wrong for our veterans to be homeless, especially as a result of this kind of an illness.
Sure, they join for the honor and the duty and all of those values that they believe in, and then they come back and they sometimes find themselves with that layer of shame. I think that you're kind of pointing the flashlight to.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah. So, in your collaboration between the University of Nebraska and Tel Aviv University, what is it that you're seeing out there? And what I mean by this question is, are the Israelis healing faster with the remedies? Kind of what say you? Because I know that one of the things you've highlighted is that it is in the backyard of Israelis, whereas in the United
Yeah,
States, we go across the pond to Afghanistan, we go across the
yeah.
pond to the Middle East, fill in the blank, wherever foreign country.
Yeah, well, Israel is on the cutting edge of many mental health treatments and lots of medical treatments more generally, but specifically with respect to mental health, the Israelis are at the leading edge. And we were really fortunate to partner with Tel Aviv University and with a psychologist there named Yair Barhem, who was he was actually the highest ranking member of the Israeli commandos, which is roughly equivalent to our SEALs or Delta Force. And he and his colleagues now at Tel Aviv University, they're all PhD psychologists, but they were formerly in the most elite force in the Israeli army, and all of them encountered PTSD and were diagnosed with PTSD themselves. And one of the things that happens in Israel is that if you have a very distinguished military career, you have lots and lots of options when you're complete. And so, to their credit, these three scientists basically have committed their lives to creating treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health problems. And but definitely, the Israelis are at the cutting edge. And part of the problem is that they live in a very traumatic country. I mean, it's just there is danger and death around the corner, everywhere in Israel. And to make matters worse, so many of the early pioneers of Israel were refugees and victims of the death camps in Germany. And one of the things that they've discovered, and is in the research, is that post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma of that level can be passed on genetically. It's actually in the genes.
The
And so
epigenetics.
epigenetics, exactly. So that even if you hadn't experienced something as horror filled as death camp in Germany, what they found is that for multiple generations thereafter, their children, grandchildren, and even great grandchildren, 4 generations later, many of them have a PTSD diagnosis. Certainly, living in Israel is a very traumatic place to be, but there's definitely some truth to the epigenetic theory that it's passed along through the genes. And so in Israel, it's definitely a very big issue, and they're taking it on probably more successfully and more aggressively than any country in the world.
Well, kudos to them for that, because I think it's much needed to have a functioning society more than just being successful at war. So one of the distinctions you made was that conventional individual or even group therapy is not enough. So what is the blind spot? Like, what are we missing, or what is that extra thing that can help? And I know it might be more than one thing.
Right. Well, with PTSD, it isn't that individual therapy or group therapy are enough. They're very, very effective. The problem is that a lot of folks with PTSD simply can't. It is very difficult for them to withstand individual therapy or even group therapy because of the severity of their symptoms. And
Is
so,
that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, is that just the anxiety, or anything could trigger them that moment?
well, it's I mean, the conventional one-on-one psychotherapy has to do with talking about what happened, and for severely affected people with PTSD, it can be too traumatic to have that conversation, and ultimately it can be very difficult to encourage clients with this problem to come to one-on-one therapy or even group therapy. So one of the things that the Israelis and Dr. Barham in particular did was to try to create a treatment that would kind of reverse engineer the treatment and kind of look at it from the other end of the telescope. So instead of what typically happens with trauma therapy is that there is at least some overt addressing of what happened. And there are treatments like EMDR, for example, which is very effective, can be kind of an indirect way into the trauma. But the technique that the Israelis developed, and that we were fortunate to develop with them, is one where instead of talking about the trauma itself, the treatment that Dr. Barham and his team developed is one that actually neutralizes the neural pathways associated with the trauma, or in other words, to actually isolate the symptoms that people with PTSD have, and to begin to neutralize them or to shape them. And without being overly technical about it, what it means is they created an app that clients can use on a computer that they can use for 10 minutes 3 times a week. And if they do that for 6 weeks, we've gotten exceptionally good results. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't require the client to relive or recall the traumatic event. It operates directly on the neural pathways of the brain and on brain activity, and specifically the attention center of the brain and how the brain pays attention to stimuli. And so by addressing PTSD from the opposite end of the telescope, rather than to go head on at the symptoms, they have found, first of all, the technique that's very effective, but is also much easier for severely affected folks to get the treatment that they need.
And
It's
to
much more
heal.
tolerable from their standpoint.
Yes. Well, what I'm hearing is that instead of just talk therapy, because to relive it, to talk about it again, could put them right back in to that moment
Mhm.
in time, which is not great if that's not something that they're emotionally ready to handle. I thought maybe you were going to say emotional release technique, but if there's something that can break the pattern, then that's good news. Because if not, it's like the rest of their life they can be in that place of shell shock and not being able to be pulled out of it.
Yes, that's very true, and sadly, the tragic result of this can be homelessness, substance abuse, et cetera, which is, in addition to PTSD itself, a real tragedy. So um, that's the reason that At Ease USA was created, and the reason that we've worked hard with the Israelis and looked at other treatments also that are that take a different approach. We certainly have and provide therapists with the most evidence-based therapeutic techniques that there are, and there are a lot of people that with PTSD who can in fact tolerate more traditional approaches. We've found that in a lot of cases that peer support groups are a really good point of entry for veterans because they are with other veterans in a safe, confidential environment, and where they can be sure that the people that they're talking to have actually lived the experience. And that's one of the most difficult things for veterans, is to try to somehow explain what it's like to be in combat to a civilian person. And I mean, it's impossible to communicate really, but to be in peer support groups with other combatants who are suffering from the same thing and recovering from the same thing, we found is in a lot of cases a more tolerable point of entry for treatment.
Yes. And I just wanted to acknowledge your work because you're not deserting them and abandoning them in their nightmare. And that's really what they're living through when they come back. When you refer to the homelessness, the suicide numbers, it's like the pink elephant in the room that people don't want to talk about because it's not comfortable. But at the same time, if somebody doesn't reach across the aisle and address what it is that they're living through, you're just abandoning them to die on the streets.
There was a number published about the number of suicides every day, or how suicides per 15 minutes with veterans. And I don't know what the number is today. I used to be able to quote the number, but it is a staggering and really sobering number when you consider that these folks have given their lives for our country. So, yeah, it's a very, very important focus, I think, to have.
Yeah, thank you for caring about this niche of society. So one of the questions I had written down is, as shell shock can imprint a whole population, it seems the Israeli professors are reaching their veterans quicker. And I wondered if you knew, in terms of the numbers, how does that compare to the United States? I know Israel is a smaller country. Uh, your thoughts on this?
I really don't know, Angelina. It's a great question. I don't have data on that. Definitely and I'll also say that the Israelis are working with our own Department of Defense here in the U.S. And with the with the NIH, the National Institute of Health, to collaborate and share best practices. But I don't have data on the relative degree of treatment in Israel versus the United States.
Yeah, well, kudos that they are doing this leading edge research, because if they can lead the way as pioneers, then maybe other countries can follow, whether that's the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, and so forth. Because we need the soldiers to come home and be able to become normalized again compared to fragmented or, having a mind that's honeycombed.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. So as I'm going to tie it back into legacy for a moment, because as we know, if somebody can get to the place of feeling like that they are balanced, psychologically safe, they're more likely to design a legacy. And one of the things that maybe coaches oftentimes don't talk about is, before you can get to the good stuff, you have to kind of deal with what I call like the 6 or 7 50-gallon drums that are attached to your speedboat. So, right?
Love that.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a light metaphor, but I'm sure you understand what I'm hinting at there.
Yes.
So I know one of the insights that you have provided is that more people would design a legacy if, and I thought you might fill in your thoughts here.
Well, I think you said it quite well. The if you can cut the ropes to the 50-gallon drums, every one you cut off will result in, will not only improve your life, but also improve your ability to build a legacy. And
Well,
so,
and sorry to interrupt. I just meant by that is all those things that we need to process, that it's like, where do we
yes,
go to process them? Who do we talk to? Because if we don't process them, burying them in our psyche doesn't doesn't always
right.
work.
No, it never works, I don't think. Because unfortunately, whatever your personal barrel happens to be, it distorts reality. It distorts our not only our view of day-to-day life and of ourselves, but specifically distorts our view of what our legacy should even be. This is why the clients that we work with, particularly with respect to with CEO burnout and high performance leader burnout, one of the things we focus on is to shift their basis of action and decision making from disturbing thoughts and emotions, which are really the 50-gallon drums you're talking about, and to shift their attention instead to something that's more enduring and will really serve them and their legacy, and that is their personal values. And so that the GPS goes to something that is for which there is a true north. Unfortunately, with disturbing thoughts and emotions, whether that's imposter syndrome or the whole legacy or bona fide mental health issues like depression and anxiety, the problem with those is that they distort our perception of reality, and also they are hugely distracting from what we really want to do, which is our values, the things we really genuinely value, the things that make life to us, that would ultimately define what our legacy should be. But if we focus our attention on the distractions in our heads, whether it's thoughts or feelings, memories, resentments, what have you, we will be distracted from what our real mission is and what our highest good is, and what our legacy should be.
Yes, I think one of the great insights you probably have been exposed to is, just as a veteran who is suffering with PTSD is living within, you could say, their own bubble. An executive also in some ways lives within their own bubble, whether it's that pressure that they're under, the loneliness factor, because they
Yes,
can't just be so transparent with their employees, their shareholders, and so forth, but also that the perfectionism, can they make a misstep without feeling the
exactly.
criticism or the eyes on them, like, oh, they're not up for the job, or how quickly and so easily we can judge others when we haven't walked 1,000 miles in their footsteps.
Yeah, very true. And I thought you were going to say that it's lonely at the top, but it really is lonely at the top, or it can be very lonely at the top. And and the problem is that you've got, if you're a CEO or a founder, entrepreneur, what have you, unfortunately, if unless you're careful, it can quickly become an echo chamber of people telling you how smart you are and how great you are,
Yeah.
which isn't entirely true. Um, but it can create an environment, and it certainly has for me, having run many businesses. It can create a situation where you really begin to wonder what's true. Do I really have any talent? Do I really have any skill here? Or have I been making it up, bluffing it, and merely been lucky all these years?
Yeah.
Which is sort of the definition of imposter syndrome. And so this is one of the reasons why I found with my clients, who are all CEOs and entrepreneurs, is that it really does help to be able to talk to somebody about that, both from a business point of view as well as from a mental health point of view, or even a spiritual point of view, to get some clarity and to have a sounding board with someone you trust who's going to tell you the way it is.
Compared to the yes men and yes women.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to echo what you were saying, that if those fears become loud enough in their heads, that doesn't do any good for their execution. You had wrote to me in an email about, you said, if I can I quote this or read this?
Sure.
Okay, you wrote, over millions of years of evolution, our brains were designed in simple terms to quickly discern villains versus heroes, predators versus prey, which can be effective for survival in the pre-modern era. But our brains today are not designed to realize, much less accept, that they are themselves the cause of our problems. And I wanted you to talk into that a little bit, because just as
Sure.
the warrior on the battlefield, whether that's in Israel in the Middle East or an American soldier in Afghanistan, whether they're thinking to themselves, I have to make a split decision. And it's very primal, it's very primitive. And then you go to the boardroom, which is that's the commercial war room. And yet that brain can easily slip back into this area that is very primal. So I'd love your
Right.
distinctions and thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, yeah, I guess the point I was trying to make is that our brains are very, very good um, with solving real problems. So whether we have a flat tire or we're trying to split the atom, our brains are very good with working on and solving very complex problems. But when the problem is essentially an echo chamber between your ears, for example, if your mind is telling you, I'm a fraud, I'm a fake, and I'm afraid somebody's going to find out, the problem with solving that problem, right, is that, and the research bears this out, is that any attempt to make that, let's call it a voice in our head or a thought or an emotion of being a fraud, any attempt by us to make that go away actually makes it come back stronger. Um, because when we tell ourselves, don't think about pink elephants, don't think about pink elephants, don't think about pink elephants, we're tattooing the idea of pink elephants on our head. So our very attempt to make a thought go away makes it come back stronger. We see this in obsessive compulsive disorder, in the clinical setting, where people feel that their hands are dirty, they wash their hands, and at least initially, it feels as though there's a relief. Now I feel that my hands are clean. The problem with washing our hands when you have the feeling that your hands are dirty is that the thought process is, my hands are dirty, I have to wash my hands. My hands are dirty, I have to wash my hands. And so, so begins an obsessive cycle.
That's what I was going to say. It's almost like they become obsessed with the problem.
Exactly. So this is
Yeah.
the problem. This is what I meant about the unreality of thoughts, is that unfortunately, again, if we're changing a tire or tying a shoe or splitting the atom, our minds are really well designed for that, for objective, real problems. But when the problem originates in our heads to begin with, the natural thing that we try to do, as we try to do with all other problems, is to either fix the problem or avoid the problem, to either fight or flee. That's our natural instinctive reaction to things. And it's very useful if we're in a combat zone being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, or even in a hostile takeover in a boardroom. Our ability to do that, our natural ability to do that, can be very, very useful. But when the problem is made up, when it really doesn't have any reality, and it's difficult when it's our minds telling us you're a fraud, you're a fake, and soon people are going to find out. How do you keep them from finding out what a fraud you are? The problem with that is that the very tool that we're using to solve the problem is the one that created the problem. So what the research tells us is that any attempt to make a troubling thought like you're a fraud go away will make it come back stronger. And similarly, trying to avoid that thought will also make it come back stronger, because our minds are so smart that they know when we're trying to avoid something, that we're trying to avoid something. So neither strategy works. The strategy that works with tying a shoe or changing a tire or splitting the atom absolutely does not work when it comes to disturbing thoughts and emotions.
Yes. Have you ever seen Succession on HBO Max?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think where you're pointing the flashlight is, there's a lot of pressure at the top, and unless we can look at these messages that are going on in our head and process them, it's just going to be a merry-go-round, or what I call like the loop around the airport, and it starts to
Right.
torment the person, and they've already got enough pressure on their shoulders. And then it's also the other thought, please, in a moment, I just wanted to share, it's also then, it's like they're contributing so much to the mask, that they have to wear this mask to look a certain way in society. All the while underneath, it's like they're crumbling with their insecurity. So please go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is the problem is that, if you have, let's take the CEO in the Succession TV show, there are some genuine problems that need to be solved. And if that were the only job to do, it would be comparatively easy. I mean, there would be maybe not clear-cut answers and still risk and reward calculations that need to be made. But if that's all there was to it, it would be considerably more simple than, but what most of us have also in the background is, a voice in the back of our heads that's actually trying to help us survive and be safe and, do all the things that cavemen and women were survived by doing. But those messages and so forth make everything infinitely more complicated. And if you also try to balance not only the risk and reward of whatever's going on in the boardroom, but also try to manage the thoughts and emotions in our heads, which are often contradictory, and everything, all of the natural fight and flight kinds of techniques that our brain is designed to use make the problem worse. So
Yeah.
it kind of begs the question, so what do you do, right?
Yeah.
If fighting the problem and trying to solve it like we would solve a flat tire, if that doesn't work, and if avoiding the problem doesn't work, what works? And, I mean, in one word, the answer is actually acceptance. And by that, I mean to first of all, be aware that your mind is going to jabber away all day long, very much like all news television stations that have to fill 24/7 of airtime with something. And our brains are very much like that, just jabbering away all the time. But a lot of it is, I hate to use this word in a way, but a lot of it is fake news in our heads. What it's broadcasting is conjecture and opinion and noise, really, but very little of it is factual. And so this is the problem. So one of the things, the key to acceptance is to realize our brain, this is where our brains are. And that to notice that there is a difference between our brain's chatter and our awareness of our brain's chatter. And that awareness that we have, the fact that we can notice our brain's chattering is, I would argue, who we really are. But our brains chattering away, we take very, very seriously. If our stomach growls, we don't think that our stomach is angry at us or that we're a bad person. We don't take it personally when other organs in our body do things. But when our brain, also an important organ, does things, we take it very, very seriously. And this can be our downfall. So the beginning is just to accept the fact that our brains say a lot of things that aren't real, aren't true, and aren't real. And that our ability to notice what's going on in our heads, just to notice, not to fix it or avoid it, but just simply to notice it, is actually the road to recovery, whether it's imposter syndrome or burnout, which is what I do so much work on today. It really begins by just noticing, wow, my head is just chattering away. And just to notice that and realize that I'm not my brain any more than I'm my appendix or my pancreas. It's just another organ that I have.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke. It's like, God, give me more cognitive dissonance.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think where you're pointing to is the observer's mind, to not be so attached. But
Exactly.
I think in our culture and society, we get so attached so quickly because that car is a reflection of us, that house is a reflection of us, our, that image. But I think where you're pointing to is, what if somebody can just exhale and take a step back for a moment and know that they
Exactly.
are not their thoughts. And I think where you're also pointing to is the complexity of two things can be true. The chatter can be true,
Sure.
but new information can also be true. And to make
Exactly.
the space for that. Would you share any other thoughts regarding burnout? And then I'd like to ask you what you would like your legacy to be.
Sure. Well, the main thing about burnout, and I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of CEOs and founders, entrepreneurs who have been through burnout, and it's a very hard thing to go through. But it's particularly difficult because of this lonely at the top scenario. Where, I mean, who do you talk to about this? But the main thing that I guess I want to share is that having been through burnout a couple of times, but successfully overcoming it about 6 years ago, is that it's never come back. I guess that's the message, is that there are some proven techniques that can absolutely relieve burnout, and do so relatively quickly. 90 days or less is my experience, if you really focus on these tools. And also that it can be a permanent recovery. And then, to your point about legacy, then it's possible to really look at what's possible beyond burnout. If I can quiet my brain, or at least change my relationship with my brain, and I can begin to see things clearly through the lens of what I want my legacy to be, then we can really live. And for a lot of us, it's the first time ever. But I guess that's the main thing I'd say about burnout, is that it's really possible to recover completely and permanently and relatively quickly. But there are some evidence-based practices that you need to follow, and they're kind of counterintuitive, but they really, really work.
Yes. And I think your bottom line is that we don't have to be the victim in our life.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, even for really stout, gritty entrepreneurs who would just cringe at being called a victim, part of burnout as a disorder is that we slip into a victim modality. And that, again, that would make any leader, certainly made me cringe. But I had to admit that at some level, I had been disempowering myself.
Yeah, I think that would be a hard thing to admit, especially for type A personalities, that the reason
Yes,
they got there was because they were so excellent at what they did. They pushed
right.
themselves so hard. So how could they let this thing come in?
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Scott, for speaking into burnout, because I think just like we don't talk about PTSD remedies enough regarding post-traumatic growth, we also don't talk about what it is to be burned out, because especially in Western civilization, it's like we're supposed to get a coffee in the morning and be productive, and then an espresso at lunch and stay productive. I mean, right? Where's that space to be?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's actually part of the problem, is just pouring more and more stimulants on ourselves all day long, in an attempt to keep up with the pace that is only necessary because we're listening to our brains. If we focused on what's really to be done, it would require much less time and much less effort and much less caffeine. Um, but again, it's very, very difficult. We're really wired to take our brains seriously.
Yeah. It almost sounds like you get to create almost new boundaries and a new identity for your clients.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily new. I think it's the true identity. Once you strip away all of the falsehood, really, and that's mostly what, as I say, most of what we think isn't true, and at a minimum isn't helpful. If you can form a relationship, a sort of a partnership with your brain, as the observer, as you said earlier, then we can use our brains in a way that's useful and productive. We can flip open the laptop when we need it and close it when we don't. But that's really the ideal relationship. And then it's possible to be who you really are and always were, once you strip away cultural expectations and DNA and a lot of other things, and you can really get to the bedrock of who you are.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. And then cut those 50-gallon drums, or at least a few of them.
Yes. Yes, I love that.
Yeah, the programming is really powerful, and also realizing, some of the stuff we're carrying might not even be our stuff, but we think it's our
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
But all right.
And
Well,
then discover it's not real. I mean, this is the,
oh,
the most sobering thing, is to discover this is just an idea that I had.
oof.
It's not 50 gallons. It's actually weightless and invisible. The whole idea that I'm dragging a barrel is an illusion. Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. And since this is a legacy podcast, and I'm always looking for that inspiration and education from the guests, as well as positive role models, would you speak into what you would like your personal legacy to be?
Yeah, that's such a, I mean, that is the question, isn't it? I mean, that's really the only question that really matters. What am I doing today that I would want to be remembered? And I guess the main thing, to answer that question, the main thing that I'm focused on right now is that I really want, my mission is to bring as many people through and past burnout, beyond burnout, into a life that is worth living and that really can build a legacy that is worthy of who we really truly are when you strip away all the illusions and wrong thinking. And so that's, I guess, what I'd like my legacy to be, is to be sure that people know that there's a ton of hope. And but that's mainly what we're trying to do. What my business, Burnout Breakthrough, is trying to do is in the next 6 months is to help 1,000 CEOs break through burnout. That's our personal, that's our mission and our vision and our values, really, is to help 1,000 CEOs in the next 6 months break through burnout. And if we could do that, I'd be really pleased.
I think you would change the business landscape, because those are the titans of Wall Street, or, whether it's private family businesses or the public companies. I think that would definitely change how businesses are led today.
Well, we're going to take a stab at it, and but I think it's a worthy mission, and that's what gets me up in the morning anyway.
That's wonderful. And if you would speak into your values and principles for a moment, what values do you get to honor?
Well, my top 3 values, and one of the things that we really preach in the Burnout Breakthrough program, as I said, is to shift our attention away from thoughts and feelings that can go a million directions and change on a dime, to something that's enduring, a real true north, and that is values. So for me, my top 3 values are God, service, and adventure, actually. And those are the 3 that get me up in the morning, that make life worth living, and that when I find myself engaging in that direction, then I find I'm a happier person, and more importantly, a more useful person. Whereas if I'm distracted by, oh God, how am I being perceived? Am I, do I look like an imposter? Do I look like a fraud? I mean, all of that is not only an illusion that doesn't really exist, but a huge distraction away from being useful. So I guess that's the number one value, is to be useful.
Yes. Well, and I think you're also pointing to meaningful work that's bringing you fulfillment and satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Is there anything else you would like to share about your legacy? If not, I'll mention a couple of the places where people can find you.
No, I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And Angelina, I love the concept of your show. I think this is really, really important stuff. And this is what it all boils down to. I remember talking to a client at one point about what my legacy would have been pre-recovery from burnout. And I caught myself thinking my tombstone might have read, Scott paid a lot of bills and worked very, very hard. And that would have been my legacy. And, not my family, not my wife, not my community. The main, the thing that would have been worthy of a tombstone at that point would have been, I worked very hard and paid a lot of bills. And that's about it. So, to be pointed in a new direction is something I'm really grateful for.
Yeah. Well, I love your adventurous spirit. You had said, let the adventure begin. And I also love
Yes.
the goal you said about the, 1,000 CEOs, 6 months, and painting that brand new vision. So it has been my pleasure equally
Thank you so
to
much.
share in this conversation, and what a positive role model you are, to care again in the depth and the breadth of your heart space, to care about these veterans, and to be also just very strategic in your accelerator, the business partnerships you're creating in this world today, where the beneficiaries can, go on in the ripple effect to help society. So I give, kudos to you exponentially.
Oh, thank you. Back at you, Angelina. You're doing lots and lots of good. This is a great podcast.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm just going to read out a couple of the places that somebody could find you, and then I'll wrap for this episode. So burnoutbreakthrough.com is your website. And there's also an assessment. I'll put this also in the show notes. And also there's a Facebook group.
Yes, if one of the best ways for people to find out about our system is go to our Facebook group called Beyond Burnout. And we are posting techniques and tools, videos, and a lot of great interaction with our members about how you can recover from burnout and to do so right away.
In closing, I'm Angelina Carleton, the hostess to the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder to Legacy Planning, a boutique coaching and advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, USA, but international in those I coach. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person to find, develop, and execute their legacy, and continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources for every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners, there can never be enough education and preparation in the moot or moat around your castle. Whether you find yourself with new wealth or generational wealth, may the content of this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your intellectual and emotional curiosity. So if you're listening today on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe, or if you're tuning in on Apple Podcasts, to rate and review. Thank you so much for joining us today.